Good morning, Asia. Good afternoon or evening in the US. Thanks so much for joining us today for this Charboost webinar. We're very excited. I think there's been a lot of expectation for it, and we're going to get started. Today, we're going to be talking with Christian Calderon, and we're going to be talking about one specific genre that has dominated on the charts for quite some time now, hyper casual, and we'll be discussing with Christian how to launch top chart games and especially how to address the most optimal ad experience, as well as running UA with games that are monetizing usually at a low LTV. So I don't think Christian Calderon deserves a big of an introduction, but we'll let him introduce himself. He is co-founder and CEO of Gamejam, based out of Vietnam, and I'm very excited to have Christian today on this webinar. As I said, there's been a lot of interest. We've got many pre-submitted questions that I've got to collect here, and this is just a reminder that if you're listening live on this webinar, you can always submit live questions. We have the chat functionality where you can just send us any questions you may have during the presentation, clarifications that you may want Christian to do at the end, and we will leave sometimes for Q&A. And I've got the pre-submitted questions that we will also try to address. And my name is Pepe Agel. I'm co-CEO here at Charboost. For those who are not familiar with us, I assume if you're listening to this webinar, you are, but for those who are not, we are an in-app programmatic platform, one of the leading monetization solutions, very focused on gaming. So we help game developers monetize their inventory. We power their monetization stack, as well as we help them run effective user acquisition. And the agenda for this webinar, we're going to start with getting to know Christian. I don't think he needs a big intro, but we'll go through his background and how did he end in Vietnam with Gamejam. We'll be breaking down some of his secrets for launching games to the top charts, keeping them on the charts, and designing the optimal ad experience. We don't want to let him leave without discussing some of the future trends, some of the hot topics that we're all worried and looking very with a lot of attention. Things like privacy, changes on iOS, the future of hyper casual. So we will be discussing future trends. And as I said, we want to leave time for Q&A. So with further ado, very excited, Christian, to have you on board. How are you doing?
Hey, good, thanks. I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be on this webinar with you and talk a little bit about our strategy and hyper casual in general. Very excited.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for, I know it's kind of early right now in Vietnam, so we appreciate your time. Christian, I know you've been in the industry for a long time, but for those who don't know you in the audience, can you tell us a little bit more about who are you, where do you come from? You've been in gaming for a long time in different companies, and so why don't you tell us a little bit more about who Christian Calderon is?
Yeah, sure. So I'm I live in Vietnam, but I'm not from Vietnam. I'm actually a Mexican American. So I grew up in the States. But I've been in love with gaming my entire life. So since I was 12, I was making games. I don't know if you remember America Online, but we used to, in the 90s, I used to join crews, like basically game jams in the 90s, and team up with other developers that were a lot older than me and make games. And so I always loved making games. Just done it my entire life. But I started my career. I was afraid that if I made, like, coming out of college, I wasn't sure if I would make a good income or have like a good life, like making games. It just wasn't something the whole business of games was something I wasn't very familiar with. So I decided to become an investment banker, and thought, that would make my family proud and a good job coming out of college. and did that, and still ended up gravitating towards games, just working on gaming deals, and so and I decided, I realized that you can actually make a good living making games, and I figured it's something that I love to do, and I think I knew I would be happier doing it. So I decided to jump into games, and I joined Kixeye um, as their head of revenue. That's where I learned to do like LTV modeling, and I learned more about user acquisition. At the time, they had a rock star UA team, and they were just really, really good at analytics, and led by Will Harbin, which was an incredible CEO. And then after that, I joined Dots. That was led by Paul Murphy, who is also another awesome CEO. And I learned that's where I actually started doing user acquisition. And I launched the game called Two Dots, which ended up being a massive success, #1 game in 100 countries. And then afterwards, I joined Ketchapp as a chief revenue officer, and I kind of switched from doing. We didn't do any user acquisition actually. It was all of our organic, all of our traffic was organic. So I did mostly monetization at that time, and working on monetization and A/B testing or App Store, and doing things outside of UA, partnerships with our ad partners. And yeah, now I started Gamejam about 2 years ago, and I'm a co-founder here. And yeah, we're a fast-growing company, and I guess in the hyper casual space.
Yeah, that's awesome, Christian. Before we get more into the details of Gamejam, how was it going from you could call it the dark side of investment banking to the bright side of gaming? How was that transition?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the best part about it was you don't have to wear a suit. So the culture in banking is so different than a startup, video game company. Actually, like, I'm wearing like sandals right now as we speak. So it's just like it's awesome because you don't have to wear all those fancy clothes. Going to the dry cleaner all the time was such a pain. So that I really enjoyed. The other part too is when you're a banker, you're always sitting on the outside, right? You're doing IPOs or M&A deals. I mean, these are substantial deals that are life-changing for the corporation, and the people, the shareholders. But you're always sitting on the outside, so it's like inside you're like, oh man, I wish I could do that, or I wish I did that. And so when you actually make the switch into a more operational role, it's totally different, but very self-fulfilling, because you're actually doing a lot of this stuff on your own, as opposed to being on the outside watching.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And looking back, Christian, if you from your beginnings in gaming at Kixeye to today, starting your own gaming studio with Gamejam, I'm sure the industry has changed quite a lot. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen since you started in gaming to today?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think the biggest changes have been at the platform level, I think, and the ecosystem. Like, for example, the App Store is different when you go into it today than it was 10 years ago. Also, it's a lot more competitive, so there's way more developers and way more apps in the App Store. And so this makes things more difficult, and changes kind of the strategy of that developers have to take. For example, I don't know if we'll ever see a business like Ketchapp again that grew over billions of downloads organically, in the video game space. So I think that maybe those things won't ever happen again, because now that whole business has been disrupted by the paid user acquisition model, right? So also partners like ad networks that were once partners now compete with developers. That was something that didn't happen to the extent that it does now. And I think that's just going to continue to happen because it's in their best interest from a business perspective. I think the CP ad revenue has gone up on a per user basis, which has made things really interesting for hyper. It's like, I think why hyper casuals, your ad-based games are doing so well, have been doing so well over the last couple of years, because there's been more of a market for that on the revenue side, which has allowed for different types of games. It's allowed for hyper casual as a category to expand. Now you're seeing the term hybrid casual, which is this comes the idea of that comes from hyper casual. And so I think you were seeing these games evolve, which is really interesting, and I think we'll continue to see changes like along this progression, over the next 5-10 years.
Tell us a little bit more about Gamejam. How did you come up with the idea, and why in Vietnam as well? I think many people may be curious to know more about the pros and cons of being there.
Yeah, so I wanted to start Gamejam because I knew that that as the market gets more competitive, and it gets more fragmented, that there's still an opportunity to take advantage of all that, and to use technology to maybe even disrupt the marketplace again. So I wanted, but it's a time sensitive thing because it's very competitive, and as you can see, the store changes, like the rules are changing all the time, right? So these things are very time sensitive. So I was like, I have to start now. And I chose Vietnam. My co-founder is he's from Hanoi, so he's from the north of Vietnam. And we decided to come to Ho Chi Minh City, which is in the south, because we knew that there's a lot of talent here. There's a lot of game studios, bigger ones that have trained, Unity developers in the masses, and so we figured that it would be a really good place to get really strong engineering talent. It was also very good. The education system here is very good. I think it's like the equivalent of like defense spending in the U.S. I think the country in Vietnam spends a lot on education, so it's a really nice thing. And I think so. You have like a highly trained, very capable, energetic workforce. And if you've ever been to Ho Chi Minh City, it's just kind of like chaotic how fast everything's growing. You see like new buildings erected, every year. Things are always changing. So it's just one of those places that's just very fast growing and evolving, and perfect, in my opinion, perfect environment for a startup.
Yep, and it's paid off, right, Christian? I mean, tell us a little bit more about your portfolio, but in 2 years, roughly, you guys have developed probably more than 50 different titles. So you've been probably one of the most prolific studios that I know over there, with very high quality titles. So tell us a little bit more about your games, and how big is the team that is working behind all these amazing titles that you guys have released?
Right. No, yeah. So so the team now is roughly I guess 13 people. We're hiring new people every week. On the game side, so we have on the game teams, usually we have a lead developer, Unity developer on each team, and then he's working with our artists, which are kind of shared resources. So we have 3D artists, 2D artists, animators, and everybody kind of works on a particular project based on what they want to work on, and what their skill set, like what they're really good at. And so each game team is kind of small, so it could have sometimes like 3 people working on a game, just on the product side. And then on the backend side, we have a backend team, and they're building our platform, allowing our platform, which is connected with like over 30 ad networks, I think at this point, and that allows us to scale the games and monetize them. And so that's I think a really important part, but that's not included in the team that's actually building the game. And then it takes maybe like a week or maybe a couple of days to build like some kind of prototype or example, and then that could go on for another 4, 5, 6 weeks, depending on how deep the game is or how much content we're putting in, or if we're working with a brand or IP, obviously we need to get feedback and approval from them. So that might make it a slightly longer process, but the games can, like a good hyper casual game without any like licensed IP could probably be built in a month pretty easily.
Wow, very impressive. And did you guys get started with any funding, or are you completely bootstrapped until today?
We were no, we raised a small amount of funding with Play Ventures.
Yep.
And that was after we had launched our first game. We invested a lot into the platform, and then once we had something that we felt was investable, we started talking to investors, and we really liked the Play Ventures guys. They were very young, and Henrik just turned 40 yesterday. To me, that's really young. And he just knew, like, they
know the space very well.
Yeah, they know the space so well. They have a lot of they had done a lot of investments prior into startups, and they just kind of got it. You could tell because like we would show some investors our game. At the time, we had this like Stickman game, and it, when you look at it, you're like, okay, this isn't like a real game. What is this, like a kid made this, or what is this? And so like most investors that we would show the game to are just like kind of laughing at the game, and which is common in hyper casual. Like you look at a lot of these games and you're like, why is this even a game? And I remember when I passed it to Henrik and Hadi, they looked at it and they're like, oh, this looks pretty good. I can get who would play this, and they immediately got it. Whereas most of these like older investors, they would look at this and they'd just be like, what is this? This is not a game. Like, what is this? So they were really awesome to have on our team.
That's great. That's great. We're gonna get a little bit deeper into your process of coming up with games, but I know that there were also some questions about this from pre-submitted questions from people that wanted to know a little bit more about your design process, right? I know there's hundreds or hundreds of thousands potentially of hyper casual games out there, probably many different ideas. For some, these ideas may look stupid. For some, they might look very fun to play. So how's your design process? How do you come up with ideas usually? Can you tell us a little bit more about the creative process within Gamejam?
Yeah, sure. So we have this. We think about everything from a game design perspective in terms of like concentric circles. So the first thing we do is we try to identify the kind of theme and a combination of themes that we could use. So for example, there are a lot of common themes that market well. So for example, like love, or something that's maybe disgusting, or something that's scary, or there's these themes and elements that bring out some kind of emotion in people that just make it so marketable. So we kind of start with ideas about that, and then once we kind of have a theme in mind, then we kind of work backwards. That's working backwards, and then we start working from the core game. And then we think about this in terms of concentric circles. So like, what is the user doing every like 5 seconds, every 10 seconds? What is that core mechanic or core gesture and does it feel good, and then we go a little bit further out, and what is the user doing every 30 seconds, every 40 seconds? Are they seeing an ad, or did they complete a level? Did they collect some type of small reward? And then every 2 minutes, are they still inside the session? Did they join a leaderboard? Did they get to see the metagame? And was that fun? And then we once those, like, we start in the middle, and like once the middle feels really good, right? Every 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it feels really good and polished and strong. Then we move on to the next ring, and then the next ring, and the next ring. And this kind of helps, because when you're a game developer, you're kind of like a kid in a candy store, right? Like, you're just, oh, I want to do this, I want to make this, I want to do that, and you're kind of all over the place. And if you develop a game like that, you miss things sometimes, and you may just jump onto the metagame too soon because you're just so excited about it, but you really didn't perfect that core mechanic, which is a really strong part of your day one retention and part of the engagement loop. And so if that's not perfected, or if you maybe even need to change that, then that becomes an issue. There's some games that I think are really popular, that have had interesting journeys, because maybe they perfected the metagame first and they couldn't find the core mechanic, or they had this core mechanic for a long time and they just couldn't find the right metagame. And so sometimes there's a mismatch there. And so we find, if we start first with the core mechanic and move our way out and just try to perfect that makes the execution less risky. It makes things easier for us in terms of like our confidence about the game, and we feel like it just makes for a better retaining game, a better engaging game.
Yep. So you said, Christian, that on average, the development time of a game can be around a month. How long is the evaluation according to these criteria that you just described? How long does it take to evaluate a game and say, okay, this is a very viable game, we're gonna keep investing in it, or we throw it away?
For us internally, so we think about this internally differently than the way we think about it with when we publish a game. But internally, we don't do a whole lot of testing, and the reason is just because our games have been copied so many times that we want to give people less time to pick up the game. So we take an approach where essentially we build a game, and we've done so many of these games that we kind of know what works and what doesn't, and what will cause drop. So if we're sticking to something that we know, we're very kind of familiar with it, and we don't have to test it too much. So kind of what we do is we work on the game internally, and when we feel like we have something that's launchable, even with minimum content, we start to soft launch the game, which is a very short process. It's just like essentially all we're doing is checking bugs, checking for crashes, any major kind of anything that will prevent us from scaling the game and spending money on it, that we can fix in like 24 hours. And so that's why we usually do this like on a Wednesday, and then Thursday, we get the Wednesday, we get the data. Thursday, we get the data. Friday, we have, we usually have the fixes in, or the game doesn't need any fixes. And then we start opening up to like all the countries, and then we just start scaling. And every day we add more content. So let's say we launch the game with like 30 levels. Every day we'll add more levels and more levels and more levels to keep pushing LTV up as we scale. And then the reason why we do this is, one, we get the speed. So if we want to try to get downloads or revenue to continue to fuel growth, we have the speed and ability to do that. And then the second is we're so fast that we can just add that content, over time to grow LTV as the game, as prices go up. So that's kind of the way, we think about launching these games. So instead of like going into test market, it's for checking like a typical game company would go into test market and like test all the features and go into weeks of the feedback loop and do all that stuff. We just go straight to launch.
I know you mentioned that you have two separate routes for your own developed games versus games that you publish. If we had anyone in the audience that wants Gamejam to submit ideas, what's the recipe for success? What are you looking for in games that get to your hands, and what metrics should they be looking at?
Right. Yeah. So it's a good question. So on the publishing side, we treat things a little bit differently, and we've taken the decision to do this because of feedback from developers. So in a lot of cases, like other publishers, the way they work with developers, we feel like is the model can be improved, and so a lot of the times we see publishers like locked up with developers locked up with publishers, or the games they ended up going in this. I mean, we've actually gone through this process ourselves, and so like you're going through this kind of like rat race of just constantly changing, improving the game, adding things, or doing whatever like the publisher manager and his team think. Sometimes it's not transparent. Like you might get like a star rating for your CPI, and you're just like, well, like what does that mean? Like, and so like sometimes like the relationship with a developer and the publisher is we feel like could be improved. So a lot of publishers set the bar really high. So like they want to make millions of dollars on a game, and because they're making hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And they need to improve their valuation and keep growing, and they're looking for these whale games. And so we decided that that it's hard. I don't think it's a very helpful process for the developer. One is that feedback loop, which is so important in hyper casual, is broken because they're, instead of knowing the CPI, they're getting a star rating, or instead of like understanding how something can scale, they're just kind of stuck in, okay, my day one retention didn't hit 50%, so I can't launch this. And I think it's kind of silly because when you think about it, startups shouldn't, like really small teams shouldn't be worrying so much about that. They should be worrying, I think, more about like break even. How quickly are they breaking even on spend? How fast can they get cash and the cash flow of things so that they can continue to invest in their team. They can continue to build games and grow their team and learn. And I think it's the best learning process, and I think it's the best financial model for startups, really small teams, is to get even a little bit of cash flow. Like, to a developer in Vietnam or India or one of these, emerging markets, a couple $1,000s a month is, could pay for a small team. So like something like, or $10,000 a month or $20,000 a month can pay for a bigger team. And so I think that is more important for entrepreneurs, is to get at least some cash flow, even if the game isn't going to be a massive success, that they should still be able to launch it and learn from it, and take whatever they can from that game, instead of it just being kind of like a total loss and time sink of not making any money and going through tons and tons of iterations on the game, with maybe little transparency. So that's kind of the approach we've taken with the developers that we work with on the publishing side, is we try to make the game work even if it's not going to be a massive success, because we want to at least provide some income for these developers, so that they can continue to invest and build in their teams, and get that experience and see the data. It's there's no better way to learn than to fail, right? And to understand like, real metrics, where they're failing and how to improve it.
Yep. Yeah, that's great to hear. I'm sure that this developer-friendly approach that you have as a publisher really comes from probably a lot of frustrations dealing with publishers yourself. So it's good to see a different approach out there. My next question is about out of your portfolio, there's been games that made it to the top of the charts. There's been games that didn't make it. From your perspective, what made the ones that got to the top? What made those games a success? Any learnings that you can share for the audience about what these games had that was unique compared to others that probably were not good enough to make it?
Right. Yeah. So the games that make it to the top, they have this incredible ability to market well. So usually, yeah, and just so it's clear, a game that gets to the top is not an indicator of how profitable the game is, or maybe even how good the game is. It just means that it's a marketable game, right? So you could have a game that has really low CPIs and that could market really well, but it's not going to be profitable to do it if the actual game is really, really bad. So that's an important thing to establish. The games that get to the top are really good at having good install rate. They have good IPMs, or install per 1,000 impressions, which is the same thing, just the same numbers presented differently, and it scales well on different channels. So for example, you might have a game that scales well with TikTok or Snapchat, and you might have a game that scales better on like Instagram or Facebook, and you might have a game that scales really well on Chartboost or Iron Source, right? And so depending on the game and where the kind of the channels where you can scale, and the games that do well, like get to the top, they tend to scale on more channels. Like they do well on everything usually, or a majority of everything. Maybe you can't get TikTok to work, or maybe Facebook is challenging, but you still would need like to get some scale with maybe Snapchat or Instagram. So I think that's really, really important, is the marketability of the game.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. And I know, Christian, you have a lot of thoughts about how to optimize LTV to keep those games charting and being able to sustain the CPIs that are needed on the market. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your tactics to, again, optimize LTV and be able to sustain user acquisition for these titles that made it to the top?
Optimizing LTV, the most important thing is having some kind of feedback loop. So it's being able to test something, right, and get feedback loop in order to measure. And we found some really interesting things. I guess we can go over some of the case studies that we have. But for the game that we're looking at now, this is Draw Story. This is the game I was telling you about, that I was showing investors, and like, what is this game, right? Like, it's just stickmen and so this game, it did pretty well. It had I think millions of downloads. When we were testing it, this is one of those cases where we found that it was marketing well, the core mechanic, but the retention was really bad, just with this drawing mechanic. So we decided to add a metagame. We decided to add a metagame, and so in the metagame, it's like kind of like a story where you're drawing something, and then you're in school, you're trying to get out of school, and so it's just like this mischievous kid and this story behind it. And when we did that, we saw a huge increase in LTV, just adding a really strong metagame. This game is the content is like totally curated, so it's a little more difficult to scale from a development perspective, because there's story, and that has and we'll go over another example of about story games in a second, but it you know, does require more development as opposed to a game that has some kind of infinite loop. And so that's something else that we learned here. But the metagame, extremely important. And so you might have a core mechanic that does well, and that markets well. And so if a lot of developers will find themselves in the situation where you might have something that it could, you know, you see that you're in your early test is marketing well, but it doesn't have the, I don't know, 55 or whatever % day one retention your publisher is requiring to publish the game. And so you need some kind of strong metagame, I think. And so the metagame helps a lot, I think, with this.
Yep.
It also gives you a good benchmark. So like, if you know with your core mechanic, maybe you get to like 20, 25%, and then you add a metagame and it maybe doubles it. You can kind of, and you do this over and over and over again, you can kind of get an idea of like how much retention you need from that core mechanic and what you can reasonably expect with a good metagame. Yeah, this next example is interesting about story games. So we had used this service that was that was online. It was like, I think it was called, I don't want to say the name of the company. So we use this like an online service. We found out that they were using Google Translate. We were paying them, and they were using Google Translate to translate our game. And the retention was just so bad. And we were like, I don't know, maybe this game's just not, you know, for the Japanese market. Like maybe they don't want, you know, a game like this. And I decided I met this guy at a conference, and he does Japanese translations, and he does for games. And so I said, hey, you know, and he took a look at our game, and he said, hey man, these translations look really funny. Like it looks like they're from Google Translate. And I'm like, no, we paid for the service. This can't be from Google Translate. He's like, no, it's like, I really think they're from Google Translate. And I was like, okay, so we decided to do a test where we would just let him translate the game. And it was incredible difference in lifetime value, like 261% change. And it was just, and then the game started doing really well in Japan. And so like, I think translations can be really important, especially for if you have a story game. Definitely have some kind of way to double check your translations. And if you're paying for them, I would just try to check to make sure that whoever you're paying is not using Google Translate, because that could have, you know, a very bad effect on the game.
That's hilarious. Thanks, Christian. It's impressive how a good translation can have such a big impact on LTV. Definitely a good learning here. So thanks so much for that. You've talked about the goal of increasing LTV, but I know you've been mentioning several times keeping the CPI low as a key metric for hyper casual games. So I wanted to ask you, and I know that you have some examples too, about how do you optimize, especially creatives, to keep those CPI lows, right? And what's the role of ad creatives on your overall UA strategy? So if you can tell us a little bit more about your process there to keep the CPI low again, that would be great.
So I think this is probably the most important thing in user acquisition today and in the future. And the reason is that as everyone has kind of the same technology to scale, right? Like we're using machine learning across like all the ad networks that we scale with on the user acquisition side, like 100% like digital connect, like API connection, or through some digital means of so we don't have to talk to somebody like we used to. We can just do it all through a computer, and this just makes things so much faster. And I think this is the future, and this is how all performance marketers will go in the future. It's going to be like this. And so I think once everybody has kind of similar technology, once this this UA technology is kind of democratized amongst the biggest publishers, the only thing you can compete on is creative. And so I think that having a really strong creative feedback loop and kind of like the discipline of evaluating the creative and changing it is going to be really important now and in the future as the technology becomes the same amongst all of us, right? And so one of the things, you know, we create when we create a lot of ads, and we try to put them. Basically, what we do is we put them into production, or we set them live within some kind of peer set or ad group, and where we're measuring the performance of this ad over time. And in the beginning, we do this kind of separately, where we try to send equal impressions to each ad format. And then we find kind of the best performing creative, and we then take that and keep that in production. And the ones that are not performing well, we try to quickly turn those off once we have enough significant data to show us that this is not as performant. And this will allow us to have overall for this campaign to have a higher IPMs, higher install rate, and then each cycle or each sprint, we try to then beat that best creative with new creative in a separate campaign where we're doing testing. And if if that's doing well, then we move it into the main campaign. We don't do this on all networks. So it's some networks, for example, if we can't spend a lot of money on a particular network, then we do the learnings on a different network that we feel we can use as a proxy for that network. And sometimes the learnings that you can get will kind of infer the changes that you make to the next set of creative. If, for example, you might find a playable ad or video ad does really well, and then you turn it into a playable ad, or you might find a playable ad does really well and you turn that into kind of a video ad, or elements of it that you take and kind of iterate on it again in future ads. And you can kind of see this in the marketplace, right? Like you see a lot of similar ads, and everyone else is doing kind of a similar approach or a mix of that ad. And it's there's a reason. It's because these teams work, and I think sometimes people even use the same ads for different games, so just because it works. And so I think having a good process for finding these ads are really important, because this is how you scale. This is how you get lots of downloads. And
How important is UA for you guys today? What's your approach, your multi-channel approach, if you want, and where do you find ROAS?
Yeah, so we spend on I think it's maybe 15 channels, and basically our approach is that we want to be able to spend as much as we can, because that's how we make profits, everywhere that we can, and we find that we're able to lower overall effective spend by being able to do this on more channels. Also, channels change over time, so sometimes a channel has a new way to target, or they have a new type of ad creative, or they allow for a new type of ad creative, or they change something in their algorithm, their pricing algorithm, and this allows for greater scale. And so being able to spend on a lot more networks and understand like what's happening at that network level, and if you find opportunities to quickly move to that opportunity, I think is really important. So being able to work with a lot of different networks, I think, is helpful in this regard. And so that's kind of the approach that we've taken. We don't work, like I mentioned earlier, we don't work with many like account managers where we never like ask an account manager to change a price for us or anything like that. We do everything through API or programmatically.
Yeah, that's awesome. For the sake of time, I know we could talk about valuable insights on the UA front for a long time, but I want to make sure that we cover the ad monetization side, which obviously for hyper casual games is extremely important. Tell us a little bit more about how do you manage your monetization stack? How important, I assume, ad revenues are a big chunk of your revenues across the portfolio. But tell us a little bit more about your monetization strategy, and again, what have you done to optimize your monetization stack?
Yeah, sure. So I think this one's important, really, really important. So one of the things that we've done is we've built internally our own mediation management layer or system. And so just like on the UA side, we're plugged into everyone's API, and on the monetization side, it's no different. And so we've built this for a couple of reasons, and it has, I think, three really, really, really amazing benefits. The first is, in a lot of mediation platforms, you'll notice they may send you may get a lot of emails like, hey, put your Unity key in, put your SDK key in, and they may send you a lot of emails, and you have to wonder why do they want my SDK key so bad? And so and the reason is because they get access to the revenue data, right? But the scary thing is that, let's say I work with 2, 3, 4, 5 mediators, right? I work with multiple mediation partners because I'm a smart, rational consumer, and I just want to figure out who's best, right? And so I'm working with multiple partners. And the scary thing is if you give your keys to any one of those partners, some networks, they can get all of your data from even games that they don't have a mediation connection with. And so that was a scary thing for us. So especially given the current climate. So we didn't want to give these keys out. And actually some mediators, they don't let you remove the keys. So maybe you can turn it off, but the keys are still there, so they still have access to the data. And the only way to fix it is to reset the keys on the ad network side. And then if you reset the keys for them, you reset the keys for everybody. And then it's such a pain. So we decided, for this reason alone, we decided to build the mediation management system. But we found it has two other really good benefits. And the second one is switching. It reduces switching costs. So let's say if I keep all my keys in the mediation layer and I just send the mediator raw values, it's safe, right? Because they only get the values I send them.
Yep.
But also I could switch the mediator really quickly. Like, let's say I'm finding that for a specific game is doing better with a different mediation platform, or I'm getting higher ARPDAU on a different mediation platform. I can, with my own mediation layer, I can switch, and that's super helpful. Then the last and the third thing is, which is I think ends up being the most valuable thing, is you control your own algorithm for sorting and prioritizing networks. So for example, like a lot of networks have an auto CPM or auto optimize, and it's a black box. You don't know how they do it. And sometimes they have logic. Maybe they tell you how they do it, but sometimes they have logic where they might prioritize their own demand if there's a lag in the API, or they're not getting the data in real time and nobody's getting the data in real time. And so there's these biases that happen that the mediator may benefit from because they have their own demand. And so if you're able to have your own unique, and everybody else on the mediator is using the same exact algorithm, right? So there's no competitive advantage. And so if you have your own algorithm for this, which is just a simple sorting rule, and you can play with this and do different types of things. You then have your own unique way for auto optimizing, and we found that it's improved our DAO by like 20-30%. Just being able to do that ourselves and experiment with changing the rules ourselves, it's had a huge improvement, and it's unique. Nobody else has the same exact formula that we do. So that gives us a competitive advantage there.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Really important, we think, for developers to have their own kind of mediation management layer.
Yep. To have full control over what's happening in their games. That's good. Related to that, I think hyper casual has been accused of kind of bombarding users with a lot of ads. What's your approach to frequency capping? Have you found there's an optimal frequency for your ad placements? How do you think about testing even all these things to make sure that the user experience is always there, and even for rewarded placements that they truly contribute to the engagement of users?
This has changed over time based on the game type and just consumer behavior. And the way we test it for each game is we look at the ad unit that's going to have the largest effect on retention is the interstitial unit, right? It's the non-opt-in ads. And so we look at the time of when we serve these ads. Everything is based on time. And then we look at the LTV for that cohort and then we can do multivariate testing within our application for different cohorts, serve ads at different time intervals, and again, look at ARPU or LTV. And for us, we found that this is the best way on average to find a good number that'll be good for this game. And each game is different depending on how quickly passing levels, the drop rates, and the overall session time. So how long is a player playing in a game in a given session? So finding the right number is important, and it's going to be different for each game. Rewarded video, as you had asked, it's also important. So we found that even showing too many offers for a rewarded video, like even spamming the rewarded video offer, could have a smaller effect on retention. But in general, offering rewarded videos is okay. And also depends on your audience too. So some audiences may not be that affected if you are showing them different types of rewarded video offers. For rewarded video specifically, treating it almost like IAP. So like with an IAP, you have good IAP games have a broad, diversified product portfolio of different types of IPs, right? So different things that you can buy. And with rewarded, it's no different. So having a diverse set of offerings for rewarded video is really important upon level completion at the start of the game, offering an item. So there's a lot of different ways, but you want to approach it like typical like Zynga PM approach to your rewarded video, of figuring out the different types of offerings that you can have and making sure it's diverse, because that will have I think the best overall impact on rewarded video revenue.
I know we're finishing up our time, and I want to make sure that we have time to cover some of the questions that we're getting. Thanks again to everyone who's submitting questions. Let's finish up with quickly your thoughts on trends. I want to start with your thoughts on hyper casual. I mean, it seems that since 2017, when hyper casual got consolidated, there's always been people trying to kill hyper casual. The usual comment would be this won't stay, but the reality, I found some charts, but it's kept growing. Here you see the number of aggregated downloads per different titles in the last years, and as you see, even in 2019, the growth has been tremendous. Also, another thing that people say about hyper casual is that the games climb to the top of the charts, but they don't stay. And we've seen even throughout 2018 and 19 and getting into 2020 that a lot more hyper casuals that made it to the top 10 actually stayed on the top 10 for more than 15 days. So overall, it looks like the genre is here to stay. And even when you look at the hyper casual games that made it to the top 100 in terms of download, the number keeps growing, right? So overall, while many people seem to be incentivized to kill it, it's a very strong genre. What are your thoughts? I assume you're an optimistic. You're optimistic about the future of hyper casual, but how do you see hyper casual evolving in the future and getting into 2021?
Yeah, so I think this is like just like there's, I mean, hyper casual has had haters since the very beginning. Like I remember when I tried to make these games like a long time ago, and I showed it to my team. They were just like, "This is not a game. What is this?" So it has had a lot of haters since the very beginning. It's interesting. I think that these games are evolving. Like as LTV, like in your chart, you're showing that games are staying in the top longer, and it makes sense because as LTV increases, you have more room to spend and keep the game at the top as prices increase over time. So I think these games are changing, and they'll continue to evolve with the marketplace, and they'll always be here for this exact same reason.
I know I'm seeing some of the questions here. We're all curious about your take on COVID-19. What's been the impact on your business particularly, and how do you see the overall impact on gaming and hyper casual specifically when we get into 2021?
So with regards to COVID-19, it's, you know, obviously a really sad situation. I think that for us, in Vietnam, we haven't been as affected by it as much as other countries. So I think it's been an advantage for us, just on the development side. I know a lot of companies are like, oh, you know, work remotely and stuff, but in my opinion, you know, you're never going to get the same amount of productivity as if the teams were together and talking in real time. And so I think that's why during the COVID times, our business doubled. And a part of that was, you know, this business is a lot of it is about execution. And so we were just able to execute in the market a little bit better than others, I think. But yeah, definitely not a good situation for the world. We are seeing that on a macro level, we've had more downloads during this time. Obviously, people at home, more people playing games, and we have seen also this similar trends of like last year in September, hyper casual, you know, didn't do as well. Like overall downloads were down for a lot of publishers. I think this year we saw a similar thing. So it's definitely not breaking the kind of big macro level trends. But for us, it was, you know, I think it gave us kind of an advantage being in Vietnam.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you detected any specific behavioral changes? I mean, I get it that people are at home in most countries and they play more or they spend more time on their devices, but have you experienced like more payers or more fatigue? I don't know. What any behavioral changes on your specific users?
For us, we've seen an increase in the frequency of rewarded video during this time. So in our games we've seen we measure how many times you watch a rewarded video per DAU, and we've seen this number or the multiple go up. And that could be a combination of product changes that we've made, but also we think it's underlying COVID has also maybe contributed to that.
Yep, sounds good. One last question on future trends, and I'll be able to take maybe two from the ones that I'm getting from the audience. But any thoughts on iOS 14? How are you preparing for a future without IDFAs? And how are you taking these new privacy measures that are removing some of the tracking methodologies that we've had so far?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think with iOS 14, I think it's scary for a lot of developers, especially those that rely on more narrow-based targeting. For hyper-casual games, we're not as affected by it on the user acquisition side because we target very broad and by nature. So any kind of broad targeting product, I think, will be not as affected by this. Now, on the monetization side, there are a lot of arguments, and you see a lot of news, with networks claiming that there will be 50% drops at CPMs, and so this is kind of a scary thing because we're mainly ad-based games, so like most of the revenue is coming from ads. So if CPMs drop by 50%, that will have a really big impact on hyper-casual revenue. So in order to combat that, there are different approaches that you could take. One is by allowing for more open access with networks of your user data. However, what legal means that's you're able to do that, and using different sign-ons from Facebook, Google. Apple's already responded to this by making sure that you have to use Apple sign-in if you try to use Facebook sign-in or Google sign-in. They were one step ahead there, and so that's something that you have to think about. But having sign-in, I think, gives some of the larger networks obviously more visibility, and they're claiming that could help improve CPMs. But it's a big product change, right? So one of the things that we've been doing is we've prepared a lot of these features in advance for opt-in of sharing, of passing IDFA, for the single sign-on from different networks, and came up with different flows of how that could potentially work. But at the same time, we don't want to rush into it. Like, we don't want to jump in and do it because we don't know what the exact CPM effect will be. The other thing about hyper casual games is we do a lot of like side ID based targeting, and so I don't know if that's going to be affected by this, right? Because our targeting is not the same. Most of the ads within our games are from other games, and so I'm not a strong believer in a 50% CPM drop for our business. I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think that just waiting and seeing what exactly will happen and then responding to it. That's what we do best in hyper casual anyways. We're used to this feedback loop of seeing something happen and then the next week responding with a fix. And so I think that that's going to be the best approach for us, is what we do best, is just to wait, see what happens, and then respond appropriately. So that's the approach that we're taking.
Yep, sounds good. One last question from the audience. I don't know if you can share what's your typical day 1, day 7, and day 30 retention from your games. Someone was asking to get some benchmarks.
Yeah, so I mean, I wish I could provide you all those. All of our games are so different. So I think it's good to think about strong retention, right? Like having 50% day 1 retention, and if you're and day 7 is 15 to 25%, that's really, really, really good. And then looking at the ratio between day 1 and day 3, and day 3 and day 7, if you have that a strong ratio, I think that's very telling of the game. For me, day 1 and day 7 are the most important. So if you have strong day 1, strong day 7, less numbers to look at are really important. I think are easier to manage, especially when you have so many games. And so if you're in that 50 to 60 range, 50 to 60% day 1, 15 to 25% day 7, you have a very strong game. Now that's doesn't mean that you don't have a game that can make money. So you have to think about these things like totally differently, because you could have a game that maybe it doesn't retain as much, but your acquisition costs are extremely low. And so to me, a more important number for startups is break-even point, like days to break even, counting the days to break even. And I think this is just the best number because it accounts for lifetime value, it accounts for retention, ARPDAU, and CPI, and all that stuff. It counts for everything. And it's just one number, so it's easier to look at. And so for hyper casual, I think if you're breaking even on spend within 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, you have a pretty good game that's also providing cash flow for your business. And that's the most important thing for small developers and startups like us, is just ensuring that you have strong cash flow to pay the teams and build more games in the future.
Sounds good. With that thought, unfortunately, we have to leave it here. But thank you so much, Christian, as always, for sharing so many good insights. And thanks everyone who participated today live. Thanks so much for your questions. Or if you're watching also asynchronously, remember that this is not the only webinar. We're always preparing good content. We love partnering with our close game developers in the community to share insights, to help each other. So stay tuned, sign up to our newsletter, and you'll get more information about future webinars. So thanks again. Have a good evening, everyone, and take care. See you very soon.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.